Welcome to tonight's Chebeague Island Historical Society Ellsworth Miller Memorial Lecture Series established by Cap Leonard. The Board of Directors offers sincere thanks to Cap for his continued support of the lecture series. Those who want to support the efforts of the Historical Society can donate online at chebeaguehistory.com. And before starting the lecture, I want to acknowledge and honor the indigenous people who were the first to inhabit Chebeague, forage its fields and forests, and fish in its waters. Questions relative to the lecture will be addressed after the lecture. Please, everyone, type questions in the chat box and select to everyone. And also be sure to keep yourself muted during the lecture series. At the end, I'll let everybody's video come on and then we'll all have a look. Tonight's lecture is titled Cooking Up Maine History with Community Cookbooks, and it will be delivered by Rachel Church, who is a granddaughter of former Chebeague pastor Tom Merrill and his wife Beverly. Rachel was inspired by the Chebeague Ladies' Aid 1961 cookbook that her grandmother helped produce. Rachel is currently pursuing an interdisciplinary PhD at the University of Maine, investigating the intersection of cookbooks and artist books. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Rachel.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to Donna and to the Historical Society. I'm going to share my screen. And yeah, thank you so much all for being here. I'm going to talk about cooking up Maine history with community cookbooks today. Once I get my slides going. And so I'm going to kind of break my presentation up into like 4 sections tonight. One, I'm going to talk a little bit about my research as a whole. Why am I even looking at cookbooks? I'm going to talk about why community cookbooks are great sources for history research. I'm going to look at case studies that I particularly looked at for the Cooking Up Maine History article that was in the most recent issue of Maine History produced by the Maine Historical Society. So we'll look at those books that I was specifically researching for this project and why. And then I'm going to go over some of the conclusions that I came by looking at these different books over Maine's history. So before we dive into talking about history and cookbooks, and I do promise I have a lot of images of old cookbooks to share and talk about, I did want to take just a few minutes to talk about how I came to this research topic and how it fits into my larger body of work. And that's because I come to cookbooks first as an artist. I was an artist first. For me, food, cooking, and recipes has played a big role in my art as my subject matter, making work that takes the cookbook form or takes the form of cooking. These are a few pieces here. I like food and cookbooks because food is a vehicle for bringing people together. The center piece here is a piece I made in 2021 when I was really missing being able to be around the table with friends and family. So I created a work where I could digitally have a potluck with them at the same time. Food also is a way that we can communicate with each other. The book on the left is a small little foldable artist book that can go through the mail that shares a food story from my experience that I would exchange with others to then learn about them through their food stories. And then the book on the right is my thesis project from when I graduated UMaine with my master's in 2020, again, home, using a book to reach out to others and tell stories, taking the cookbook form to talk about community. You know, you see a spiral bound half letter size book and you think community cookbook. You think this is about a community, and it's particularly probably a community of women. So I used that cookbook form to share my story of cooking, of food, of gender, of family in a cookbook. So this piece here, this is the last art piece I'm going to show you before we dive into the history. But this piece was my most recent artwork, and it stemmed specifically from a community cookbook. I made it in response to a community cookbook that was made in 2021 by the Wednesday Morning Women's Group in Vienna, Maine. And they made that cookbook to come back together and create community after spending the year apart physically, as we all did. So I wanted to make this artwork to really honor and draw light to the women and the stories behind the dishes that were in their books. This is made from different recipes that they gave me. They shared their stories, their photographs, they recorded videos for me. I went up and talked with them, or I made the food from their recipes. And I'm showing you this work because I want to show you why cooking and cookbooks are important to my art practice, which is what led to my PhD work that Richard mentioned earlier, looking at the intersection between cookbooks and art. What's happening when these things combine? And for me to do that, understanding the history of cookbooks and what that brings to the artwork that is drawing from this subject matter is really important. And that's where this current research I'm going to share with you today stemmed from. So while I was working on the project you see on the screen here, which took a full year from concept to finished artwork. At the same time, I was also working on what became the Cooking Up Maine History article that was recently published by the Maine Historical Society, which also took over a year from idea to publication. If you want to see more about my artwork, I'll have my website available, and I'm more than happy to talk about that later too. But now let's talk about cookbooks and history. And first off, let's define what is a community cookbook. And for my research, I looked to the words of Don Lindgren, who is an antiquarian bookseller in Biddeford, formerly of Portland, Maine, and a cookbook historian. And he says that a community cookbook can be defined by these three things. First, that the books are produced by members of a recognizable community, a church auxiliary, fishermen's wives, or Grange Hall members, for example. Second, that the recipes were compiled from sources within that community. And third, that the books were sold to raise funds for a charitable or benevolent purpose. So that's the definition that I used for my research when I was going forth in writing this article. And why are community cookbooks even valuable as historical research objects? A couple of main reasons. One is their historical documentation of women's lives, and depending on the place and the time, they may be the only historical documentation we have of women's lives in history. When I was doing starting my PhD research, I was talking with a historian up at UMaine, Rachel Snell, and a research she did for her PhD. She was looking at this one town, a small town over a 10-year period in the 18th or 19th century. And she goes, I went to the newspapers and looked through the archives, and not a single woman died in 10 years in that town. That's not true. It wasn't recorded in the newspapers, but it was recorded in the cookbooks that women owned in their homes. So these cookbooks can be particularly community cookbooks and manuscript cookbooks, which are an individual book that a woman might own or annotate for her own use, are really important historical documents where we might not have any record of women's lives in the past. The other reason why community cookbooks can be really valuable in historical research is because they are self-published by the community. They are more accurate. They more accurately depict what people cooked and ate in a given community in a given time than the commercially produced cookbooks we might have from that era. The commercially produced cookbooks, they show what publishers, corporations, what general society expected women to cook and serve to their family, but not necessarily what they were actually cooking. Whereas a community cookbook where it's crowdsourced, where your name is attached to the recipe, so it's got to be really good, more accurately represents something that people were actually cooking and eating in the time. The last reason why community cookbooks are really valuable in historical research is when we have evidence of the fundraising causes. If it says it in the book or there's documentation about why the book is being sold, it shows the values of that community. Were they raising funds for a particular cause? Were they raising funds to maintain a community center or do improvements on a building in town? That information is in the cookbook, is often in the cookbooks that you might not expect. So these are 3 reasons why community cookbooks can be really valuable sources of historical research. But let's now talk about the actual books that I looked at for this particular article, because I was started with a number of books and I did have to narrow it down for my research. There's so many that I could have looked at. And I picked 4. These are all books that were produced in Maine, and they span just shy of about 150 years of Maine history, 50 years apart or so, give or take 10 years. These books come from a wide range of communities, both big and small: Portland, Shebig, Orono, the entire state. They come from rural or not. They come from coastal communities and inland communities, so a nice distribution of communities are represented. As you'll see when we look at the photos, they have a variety of construction types and formats that we can look at as they change over time. And the other thing that ended up being really valuable about these 4 books is I was able to not only find some secondary sources, other people who were talking about them, or I knew people who had firsthand knowledge of these books, and I could reach out and interview or email or talk to people who were part of the book creation. But all 4 of these books I was able to access on my own. I was able to touch, to actually flip through the pages and use all of that experience to inform the conclusions that I made by looking at these 4 books. So the first book that I looked at is called Fish, Flesh, and Fowl, a book of recipes for cooking. This was compiled by the Ladies of State Street Parish in Portland, Maine in 1877. This is not only the very first community cookbook that was published in Maine, but it was actually the very first cookbook of any kind published in Maine. Something you might note here is the recipes don't look like what we see recipes looking like today. They're in the narrative form. And one of the reasons may be this took up less paper. So less paper means less printing costs, means more money to go towards your fundraising causes. So these are all listed out in narrative. The other thing you'll notice is missing is oven temperatures. It's because we didn't have electric ovens in 1877. So keep in mind the narrative form when we're looking at books in the future. The next book I looked at is The Orono Cookbook to Make the Butter Fly, which has to just be a pun. I can't find any other evidence as to what that's for, except that it's a pun. And this was compiled by the Ladies of the Methodist Episcopal Church in Orono, Maine in 1909. Sorry, I got muted. So what I was saying, here we're still seeing the narrative form like we saw in the previous book, but we're starting to see some attributions, some names of the people who contributed the recipes to this book. The other thing we're seeing are advertisements. This book is full of advertisements. In fact, there are 48 pages of advertisements to 54 pages of recipes in this particular book. I counted when I got a chance to have my hands on it. And this might seem odd at first, but actually that's not uncommon, terribly uncommon, maybe to this degree, but not terribly uncommon for advertisements to be in community cookbooks. And just like the reason to maybe stay in the narrative form when more modern recipe forms are starting to show up, if you're selling advertisements, that'll help pay for your printing and binding costs, which again means more money for your fundraising goals. So we'll talk more about these advertisements in a minute. Now we move up in history a little bit more. The third book that I was looking at, which probably actually in the order in which I looked at books was the first one, is the Shebig Island Cookbook, compiled by the Ladies' Aid of the Shebig Methodist Church in Shebig Island in 1961, as we heard previously. This photo here is actually a copy of my mother's copy printing. That is my own personal copy that is much cleaner, less stains, and newer. So you'll see we jump between two different books as I take pictures of this one. So here, this looks more like a conventional community cookbook to the modern eye. We see comb binding. We see half letter size pages. This is the size of a regular letter page, cut in half and bound. We see the more modern recipe format with the ingredients listed above and the instructions below. And we see oven temperatures, because oven technology has changed. The other thing you'll notice here is that there are illustrations throughout this book, peppered in amongst the recipes. There are large-scale illustrations. This is the Island View House of important places throughout the community. And there's even a hand-drawn map on the back cover. So it's evident through these illustrations that the physical place of this community, the island, the ocean, is really important to this community. And then the last book that I wrote about for my paper is the Maine Bicentennial Community Cookbook, 200 recipes celebrating Maine's culinary past, present, and future. This was compiled and edited by Margaret Hathaway and Carl Schatz, who I think might be in the room tonight, so looking forward to talking to you again. It was created in celebration of Maine's 20th anniversary of statehood and represents all 16 counties in Maine, and was produced in 2020. And the first thing you might notice about this picture is it doesn't look like what we think when we think of a community cookbook. It has that perfect, it's glossy paperback binding. It has, as you'll see, full color printed pages. And in fact, they worked with Islandport Press for a book publisher for its production and distribution. So you might be looking at this and think to yourself, is this even a community cookbook? One thing I'll point out is, like the previous books we've looked at, many of them were also printed and bound by a printer or bookbinder. Fish, Flesh, and Fowl looks like any other commercially produced book at the time. And even the Shebig Island Cookbook, with the visual cues that we now see as synonymous with self-made books, was sent to a printer for copying and binding. The technology just wasn't available to do it themselves at that particular moment in time. So I would like you to keep an open mind here that all of these book creators, all 4 of them, took advantage of whatever technology and services were available and affordable to them at the time, which means using a typewriter when they had a typewriter, using a computer, if you have a computer, a Xerox, or even a print-on-demand book service. Some book creators are using that now. Or it also means working with local services like printers and binders when the technology is affordable and available. Technology has changed over time, and so what is a community cookbook will also look different. And if we go back to Don Lindgren's definition, this book is created by a recognizable community with recipes sourced from within that community, that being the state of Maine, the whole state of Maine to celebrate statehood, and that the funds raised go towards charitable causes. In this case, funds from this book went towards hunger causes in Maine. And according to their website, as of today, as of December of 2020, over $25,000 has been donated to Maine organizations fighting hunger as a result of the sale of this cookbook. So speaking to the aspect of the community, of Maine as the community, in an interview with Louisa Katzen on the Let's Talk About Food podcast, Margaret Hathaway discusses how this book was intended to be by and for the people of Maine from the get-go. She explained it would include all kinds of people who lived in Maine, people like Carl, who had families that had been here for a long time, but also, like Carl, had families who immigrated from other places and really kept their food traditions. We would do a book that was inclusive, that was diverse, and that included all 16 counties. So to do this, they crowdsourced recipes from all over Maine through a website portal. They solicited through channels every channel they could think of: social media, television, public radio, libraries, and in newspapers. And this is a couple of pages from that book on the screen now. What we can see here is we have the modern recipe form, but we also have the inclusion of a narrative, a story about this, giving just more depth to the history in these recipes. We have a diverse representation of Mainers. We have noodle pudding from the Levine chapter of the Levine chapter, Banberth Waterville chapter in Waterville, with Eastern European immigrant roots. But then we also have in the same book, Congolese salt fish from a New Mainer in Portland, from the Democratic Republic of Congo. The other thing that they did was, in that portal where people submitted their recipes and they submitted their stories, people could also submit photos. They could submit scans of recipe cards. And something that I really love that Margaret mentioned in one of the interviews that she gave was that those became the illustrations for the cookbook. Unlike a modern cookbook you might see today with glossy pictures of the photo, all perfectly staged and looking beautiful, instead this book is illustrated with family get-togethers, with ephemera, with tablecloths and place settings, because it was important that this was about the act of coming together in the community that's created through food versus the goal of making a visually perfect dish. And I really liked that sentiment. So those were the 4 books that I looked at for this particular research. And what were some of my conclusions by looking at 4 books over 150 years in Maine? First, that Maine has always been connected to national and global foodways, and our connections have increased over time. I think that you might expect to see lobster, to see seafood in these recipes, in these Maine cookbooks. But even all the way back to 1877, we see coconut flakes. We see evidence of ingredients that are coming from somewhere else, being a very prevalent part of the food system in Portland, Maine. Here we see from the 1877 Fish, Flesh, and Fowl, as well as the 1909 Orono cookbook, recipes for Indian pudding. In fact, Indian pudding was in all 4 of the cookbooks that I studied in this paper. What does this recipe tell us? This is a great example of this. It's example of Maine's colonial history. Indian pudding is based off of the English recipe for hasty pudding. So that recipe was brought over in colonial times, but it was made with an American ingredient, cornmeal, which was referred to as Indian meal by the colonists. Of note, Native Americans did not make this dish. While they did make cooked cornmeal dishes, they would not have had access to milk or spices that are used in Indian pudding. So this is a very uniquely colonial combination and invention here. It also calls for molasses and often spices like ginger. So now this colonial dish is also evidence of connection to foreign places through trade, including Africa and the Caribbean with the molasses and their connections with the triangle trade. So this recipe is a traditional Maine recipe, but when you look at it a little deeper, it really shows that the connection that Maine has with all of these parts of the world, even back to 1877 when this first book was published. Still looking at, interestingly, in the Orono cookbook, and another interesting find is this recipe for macaroni. This would indicate that there was beginning to be an awareness of Italian cuisine that was being brought over by the influx of Italian immigration beginning in the 1880s in the United States. But what's particularly interesting, I think, about this recipe in this particular book is it is listed in the vegetable section. So this leads me to believe that maybe while Orono women were aware of it, they weren't quite sure yet how to categorize it within their current cuisine. Maybe because Italian women were not yet included in the Orono community, or physically or socially. But there was an awareness that's being seen here. Now we move on to 1961 to Shebbak Island, and we see even more awareness of international cuisine. Lasagna, American style, Chinese American chop suey, Spanish rice. There are others in these pages. In addition to the availability of international foods, soy sauce, crispy chow mein noodles seen here, overall by 1861 in this cookbook, we see many more nationally and internationally grown and packaged foods and national named brands. For example, in this book, there are 11 dishes that contained canned pineapple. That's not a main ingredient, but canned pineapple production in Hawaii peaked in 1957. So that makes sense that it was very prevalent in Maine cooking in 1961. There's also multiple recipes that specifically call for grape nut cereal, which was heavily marketed at the time as a wholesome and healthy choice in magazines, and including the newly debuted Andy Griffith show, which debuted, if I remember it correctly, the year earlier and was quite popular. And then in 2020, with the Maine Bicentennial Community Cookbook, we're seeing this connection to places beyond Maine to expand to more just than an awareness of international cuisine, but also recognizing the people and stories that brought that cuisine to Maine. Here again, we've got a two-page spread from this book, and on one side we have Cynthia Snow's kielbasa recipe that was brought over when her grandmother immigrated from Lithuania. Next to Nala's Iraqi kafta and eggplant and rice recipe, she moved to Portland in 2016. So in the same book, we're not just seeing the recipes or the evidence of awareness of international cuisine, but the people and the stories that brought this cuisine to Maine. The other thing that we can see over time when we're looking at all of these cookbooks together is changing gender roles and gender expectations. And we see this in a couple of different ways. One is simply an increase in men's names in the recipe attributions. While there were no recipe attributions in Fish, Flesh, and Fowl, it was created by the Ladies' Aid. And in the Orno cookbook, there are some attributions, but they're all names of women. To a couple of men who are in the 1961 Shebig Island cookbook, and to 2020 in the Maine Bicentennial Community Cookbook, nearly 25% of the people who contributed recipes to that project were men. And here's a picture of one from that on the screen now. Beto Ramirez of South Portland, who contributed coconut lobster curry. So also an example of that coming together of people and cuisines and places in Maine through cooking, and shown in a cookbook. Another way that we see changing gender roles is in those advertisements that I talked about earlier in the Orono cookbook. Within those advertisements, we see evidence of women working in non-traditional jobs. So this is an advertisement to have your books bound by Earl Grey, who I understand was the binder of this cookbook. There were, so this was Orono was a college town at that time. So there were a lot of influx of people in and out. And women were admitted into the university at that time as well. They'd been admitted for about 20 years at this point. So, but interestingly, there were other examples of women doing non-traditional roles during this time. For example, the St. John Universalist Church in town was being served by an ordained female pastor, Nellie Mann Opdale. So that was really interesting to see, and goes against what we might expect to see for women's jobs in 1909 in rural Maine. The other thing that is interesting is that there are advertisements in this book for traditionally male products and services that are in a book that's about home cooking, a traditionally female topic. So this could mean one or two things: that either women had significant influence in the buying power of these traditionally male items and services, things like horses, lumber, canoes, things like that. Or it could mean that men were also in the audience for this cookbook, a home cooking book. And both scenarios could suggest less rigid gender roles than we might assume about a Maine community in this time period. The other way we can track women's roles over time in Maine is to see changes in how women are giving attribution to themselves when they contribute a recipe. So, for example, in Fish, Flesh, and Fowl, there were no attributions. It was just the Ladies' Aid as a group created this cookbook. In Orno, we see some attributions, but interestingly, we also see a mix of some women who were using their own first and last names, and some who were using the names of their husbands. For example, Mrs. Horace B. Haskell. So in both cases, women may not be giving themselves credit for the recipes that they contributed, because it just simply had not yet become the established norm in community cookbooks quite yet. But the fact that some women in the Orno cookbook are giving themselves attribution leads me to believe that in that case, these women are choosing to do so and some women are choosing not to. It could speak to how women are valuing their contributions, whether or not they deserve to be named and recorded for their contributions. And maybe this seems far-fetched in our own modern time, but this sentiment is actually echoed by historian Janet Theophano's cookbook research too, that during certain periods of time, women were not recording their own stories and names because society did not feel that it was worthy to do so. So it could be a combination of those things. Another and then in the 1909 cookbook. It is interesting that when they are named, some of them chose to not use their first and last names, but instead go by their husband's names. Even though this book was primarily for a female audience on a traditionally women's topic. Of course, this could be because those women who did not use Mrs. Horace Haskell simply were not married yet, so that's why they chose to use their first and last name. But it could also be that they wanted to take ownership and identify themselves by their own names in this setting. So now in the Shebig Island cookbook, all recipes have attributions now, and including the committee members, the illustrator, the typist, nearly all women are using their own first names here. There's only one example in this book of somebody who's choosing to go by Mrs. and her husband's name. And I think that also the naming of the individuals on the committee is also another step towards being proud and having ownership of your individual contribution to this book. Yes, this was made by the Ladies' Aid, but it was also made by Diane Caldler, Madeline Brewer, Jeanette Hamilton, Beverly Merrill, with illustrations by Betsy Ross, Martha Hamlin, and Madeline Brewer, and the labor of doing the typing by Beverly Merrill. Finally, with the Maine Bicentennial Community Cookbook, all contributors are using their first and last given names. The last big thing that I see looking at all 4 cookbooks is a widening of who is included in the community that these books are by and for. So in Fish, Flesh, and Fowl, 1877, the recipes were seemingly collected by only those who were ladies, typo, of the church. Lack of attributions and lack of stated fundraising goals in this book could suggest that this book was intended to be sold within that church community too, because everyone in the community would have known who they were and what they were raising money for. I had the opportunity to go into the church archives, and I could not find any evidence anything specifically linking in the church records what the sale of this cookbook went towards. But interestingly, I also didn't see any records of printing costs being paid out, binding costs being paid out. So that leads me to believe that, the women were completely in charge of this project. They controlled the entire project. It was not in the general church records. The other thing I saw in another secondary source was by the second edition, which was printed in 1894, that may have been raising funds for the building of new spaces at Maine General Hospital, Portland's Home for the Aged, or other mission projects behind the state of Maine. So speaking to the widening of community, this shows that those fundraising causes, those values, are outside of their own space. They're widening their space through the funds raised, or widening the scope of their community through the funds raised by the cookbook. Even if the book itself was created within this and meant to be sold within this community. In the Orono cookbook, there were some really interesting things that led to my thoughts that this was intended for a wider audience. One being that the cookbook that is created by a church includes information about services of the other churches in town. So this is obviously not meant to be sold just to people who go to the Methodist Episcopal Church. And again, Orono was a college town at this time. There may have been a lot of people coming in and out of town at any moment. And so this could be meant for them too. So that if you're new to town, we're glad you're here. Here's a book about our community, and it includes the different places where you can worship. The things that led me to think that maybe this book was created by people who were wider than just the ladies of this particular church is that some attributions include a place name. For example, here we've got Leah Baker from Troy, New Hampshire. This signals that maybe she's in Orono now, but she wasn't from Orono originally, but she was still welcome to contribute to the community of this community cookbook. The other interesting one that you can see on the bottom picture is an attribution for a Mrs. C, with the name kind of just a line for the rest of the name. This makes me think that maybe the compilers, the people who were creating the cookbook, didn't even know everybody who was contributing recipes to this book. Because if they had known everybody who was contributing recipes, if somebody's name came in and they couldn't read who Mrs. C was, they could have figured that out. They could have asked her. They could have sought her out. So I think this is maybe evidence that the ladies of the church didn't even know all the women that they welcomed to contribute to this cookbook. Again, a widening of the community in this cookbook. When we're talking about the Shebig Island cookbook, I spoke with Donna Daniels about this cookbook being made, and she said that the committee, they went around the island and got recipes from almost everybody. So it reflects who was here at the time. Those people whose names are in the book weren't even necessarily connected to the church. The committee deliberately sought out recipes from the entire community so this book could represent the entire island community. And I think the biggest thing that speaks to the evidence of that is the title of the book. This is not the Shebig Methodist Church cookbook. It's the Shebig Island cookbook that was compiled by the Ladies' Aid of the Methodist Church. So again, an inclusion of community here, both who's included to participate and who it's for. And lastly, the Maine Bicentennial Cookbook, Community Cookbook, is widening both geographically and in specifically seeking out who's included. The recipes were crowdsourced deliberately from all 16 counties through a website portal, and again, and trying to get the word out all over the state so people could participate. They wanted to accurately depict the diversity of Maine through recipes and stories and photos from families who immigrated many years ago, but also to new immigrant populations that are in the state now. And they wanted to represent and show respect to the Indigenous people and the foodways that have been in Maine long before statehood. I had a really lovely email correspondence with Carl and Margaret about this, and how in the bicentennial book there are no Indigenous recipes, but instead there is a land acknowledgement, there is an article about, a scholarly article about Indigenous foodways. And it's because they were talking with the community, they were talking with the Indigenous community and discovered, oh, the bicentennial is kind of a painful event. So instead of the recipes, there were those other things in the Maine Bicentennial Community Cookbook to honor and acknowledge and show respect to the Indigenous people and foodways. And in their second edition, which is out now, which does not have a bicentennial connection, there are recipes from Indigenous people and Indigenous foods included in that second edition of this cookbook. So I have two parting words in my last couple of minutes here. Parting thoughts, overall thoughts about community cookbooks that I want to leave you with tonight. And something that was really powerful with me is that cookbook creators now, like Hathaway and like Margaret and Carl, are recognizing the power that community cookbooks have in documenting both the history of the past and what will become the history of tomorrow. They recognize that they have the opportunity to preserve the history of Maine through those food stories and memories, like of the Lithuanian grandmother's kielbasa recipe, of those populations who immigrated over. And that they can they can make a book that can accurately depict the Maine community of today for generations to know about in the future. We talked about this earlier, how stories of women, and I will add to that also minorities, immigrants, are often left out of traditional recorded media, which could lead to future generations not even knowing these histories because they don't exist in the record. Or because there's no evidence, or if the information is recorded in traditional media, it's often from a majority or male point of view. So community cookbook authors today are recognizing that through the power of self-publishing, They have the power to create what will inform the history making of tomorrow by including these stories, both of the past and of now, that have historically not been included through recipes, through these recipe stories. An example here, we looked at these images before. We've got a family that immigrated here years ago, and we've got somebody who immigrated here not that long ago. Their record, they are now in print so that their stories and their evidence that they are here will be recorded for future generations. And lastly, community cookbooks are both historical documentation of a community and active tools for community building today. I'll leave you with two quotes here, one from Don Lindgren. He talks about each element of the process of making a community cookbook made connections and strengthened networks. Compiled recipes were gathered from community members. Small town business advertisement supported the project while introducing the businesses into the kitchens of local families. Local printing, either professional or homemade, produced an object that in both process and materiality physically reflects the community. Thinking back to the project I showed you at the very beginning of this slide, the women of the Wednesday Morning Women Group who made a community cookbook after being apart during the thick of the pandemic, for them, that is exactly what this was. It was not just documentation of this community, but process of coming back together and creating community after time apart. And then Margaret Hathaway again on Let's Talk About Food. The community, and they're talking about their experience of creating the cookbook during 2020 and during the height of the pandemic. The community that had shared their recipes with us became even more important to us during those first few months of the pandemic. We felt like they were connected to us at a time when we all felt such disconnection. The act of making a cookbook helped strengthen connections with others even when they couldn't be physically together. And this I thought was really lovely, how it has a life of its own. After the book's publication, organizations started online cook-alongs and were creating community over Zoom and Facebook. And so this book that began to build community outside of itself. And for us in a year where so much has been so challenging, to know that food connection started in our harebrained scheme have felt great. So a tool for creating community even after it went out into the world. So thank you. I'm a few minutes over what I hoped to be, but it was a long paper that I tried to condense into a very short period of time.
All righty. Well, Rachel, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation and bringing together about the history of people and our communities and what we eat and our recipes. So I'd like to ask everybody who wish to let's see, you can start your video. You have to do that yourself, and then if you like to ask questions, just speak out or raise your hand or whatever. Just have at it. Or if you want to leave some comments in the message, I'll try to find them and read them out. Anybody? Speechless. Well, that's pretty good. I think you covered the topic pretty well. I was impressed with all of the especially that earliest book. That was an amazing piece of record, like you say, how it really encapsulates the culture of the times and who was cooking in the kitchen then and now.
Richard,
Mary. Cap. Go for it, Cap.
I was wondering, in all this wonderful research, whether our presenter found interest in communities to produce new cookbooks. Any interest on Shebig Island of doing another cookbook?
Well, I can't speak to Shebig, but I know that cookbook I talked about in Vienna, Maine, was a second cookbook for this group, and it had only been 10 years since they had done the one before. So I think there's always opportunity to create another cookbook and record what's happening in Shebig right now.
Thank you.
Mary, your hand is raised, I see.
Sure. Rachel, your lecture was so interesting, so lively. I hope that you have other topics that you could come to us and give us more lectures. It would be wonderful.
I will keep you afloat. Yeah, like I said, this is, I also, I'm an artist. I'm always making artwork as well, and more than happy to talk about that. If people want to learn more about that, my website, rachelchurch.com, has a lot of my artwork and some of my scholarship. And then I'm working on my PhD, so there will be absolutely more research about cookbooks, about art forthcoming.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Fascinating, interesting, easy to connect to.
Stacy, I see your hand raised. Oh, you need to unmute.
Rachel, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I love cookbooks, and this was just great. How did you make those plates?
The plates. Yeah, that was, like I said, that was a year-long project. And I actually got a residency and some assistance to finish that project through Maine Media, which allowed me to have access. So most of the text is printed in letterpress. The blue images that you see were created using a process called cyanotype. And this was made in an edition of 10. So there are 10 identical boxes with 10 identical sets of plates in them. So those would have been printed one by one in the sun.
And were the plates heavy paper?
They were there were 3 different types of paper, depending on which process I was using for that individual plate. And they were printed flat, cut out, and then carefully cut and glued just a tiny bit to give them that plate shape.
Very, very effective. Very effective.
I went back and forth between, am I going to print on paper plates, or am I going to print on paper and then turn them into plates? And that's what went out. But it was a tedious
They're
process.
really great. Really great. Really unique. Yeah.
Jill, go ahead, speak up, Jill. You got to unmute. There you go.
All right. Thanks so much, Rachel. Everybody said it. It was great. It was really fun and entertaining. I've wondered about the impact of the internet on the ability for any of us to just go out and find, oh, I want to cook broccoli. What's an interesting way to do it? As compared to my mother's generation that definitely went to a cookbook every time. And did you have any thoughts about that as you've talked with communities about community cookbooks?
That is actually a really big component of my dissertation research. Because most of the time, if you and I want to go cook something, do we go to a cookbook first, unless we specifically remember, oh, I want to make that one blueberry muffin recipe that's in this particular cookbook because my mom made it for me and it's my favorite one? Or do we go to the internet and do we Google it? So that is part of my dissertation research. Is I'm writing about how really the purpose of cookbooks is kind of changing. That what was originally intended to be a utilitarian object, a teaching tool, an instructional book, they're now doing something else for us. We're still buying them, we're still reading them. And why are we doing that? It's because they connect us to other people. It's because they tell stories. It's because they connect us to other places. I think cookbooks are becoming more and more art objects in our society, while still functioning as instructional aids when we do choose to cook for them. So yes, absolutely, that is something I am thinking about and researching and writing about.
Interesting. So true.
Very cool. Okay, well, if nobody has any other questions, all I say is I think I'm inspired. Perhaps it's about time we come up with another cookbook. It's been a couple of decades since 1961. It's a great idea. Anyway, so thank you, Rachel, again. Let's see. Please join us again next month on March 25th at 7 p.m. when the lecture series will bring Earl Shuttleworth will be our lecturer. So I believe that concludes everything for tonight. Thank you all for joining in, and good night. And once again, thank you so much, Rachel. It was very
Thank you
wonderful.
so much for having me.
Yes, thanks for coming. Bye-bye.